Andrew in Bethlehem, how are you?
Hey, how you doing?
Bethlehem, really?
In PA.
Just a coincidence.
Yeah.
But I had a question. Supposedly the Big Bang created space and time, but energy and mass cannot be created or destroyed. So I was wondering, how could energy mass exist without space and time?
You need to call a physicist show, first of all. Second of all, the basic laws of, conservation of energy and everything may not necessarily have applied then. But third, that the origin of the universe doesn't necessarily have to violate those things.
Yeah, because that's the question that always comes to mind when I believe that God created the Big Bang.
The total energy of the universe is zero. Which means it does not. There's no violation of the conservation of energy in the appearance of the universe.
So, what makes you think God did the Big Bang?
Well, to me, it's just illogical that energy mass could be without space and time. I understand that.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that. What was that?
Well, how could energy mass? It seems dependent on space and time.
There's a limit to the depth of the science you're going to get out of us, but you really should be talking to physicists.
It seems more illogical than scientific.
Okay, it can seem that way to us laypersons, but are you aware that the great majority of physicists are not Christians, are not theists, I should say?
Well, I believe there's about 75% that aren't theists.
Okay, so if it's so obvious, if this thing that seems obvious to you is so obvious, how come it's not obvious to those guys, the guys who actually do the work?
The more important question, why are 25% theists? That's the more important question.
Because it's easy to compartmentalize, but these other guys, Well, there are more unbelievers amongst physicists than there are in the general public.
Yeah,
why there are still some is not the question. Why so many of them are not believers, that's the question.
Yeah, out of the people who understand this subject the best, the overwhelming majority of them do not find it more reasonable that a God did it. And I'm still wanting to hear why you think it's more reasonable that a God did it, when what we're talking about is something that we don't understand and cannot even investigate. So, therefore, there can't be evidence to support your position, and I wanted to know why you had it.
Well, I just happen to be a theist because I'm a born-again Christian, and I had first-hand experience with God.
So you have a preconception or a presupposition that God exists, so you're trying to fit him into the science.
Well, I'm not trying to fit him in. I'm just saying it's just equally credible than what physicists come up with, which to me seems illogical.
Well,
because I can't imagine energy mass without space and time.
Considering that you don't seem to understand it, I don't know how you can claim it's illogical. But my point was, you're not following the evidence, you're leading the evidence. You were already a believer in the Christian God, and now you've been convinced by evidence that the Big Bang is the best scientific model of the origins of the universe, and then you're trying to plug your God into the gaps into the gap areas where we don't have complete answers yet. And
well, to me, the gaps are facts.
What?
To me, the gaps are facts. This is the God of the facts because God fulfills all of the necessarily criteria that would account for a first cause.
Well, no, he wouldn't, because to account for a thing, you can't just make up some other thing. You have to show that the thing that you're using to account for the open questions actually exists. I mean, you can make up things to account for all kinds of stuff. But if you can't show that the thing that you made up actually exists, then you haven't really accounted for it. You've just made things up.
Well, God would subsist, not necessarily exist. Exist means what exists in space and time. God would be transcendent, so God would subsist. God would be a foundation.
What evidence do you have that anything like that could possibly exist?
Well, for one thing, say science. science relies on cause and effect. It has that assumption. Otherwise, we can experiment, because when we experiment.
Okay, so what's the experiment you did? What's the experiment you did that demonstrated that your God exists?
Well, God fulfills all the necessary criteria.
That's not an experiment. That's not an experiment. I could say, I could make up some creature that spews out these aluminum ACA mugs, right, as part of its biological process, and I have now accounted for that mug. But if I can't show that the creature really exists, I'm just flapping my gums, and that's what you're doing when you try to account for things about the origin of the universe, which, by the way, the physicists who understand those things, for the most part, reject your God and don't agree with you, right? So we got to keep reminding you of that. But making up something and calling it your God and saying that is the thing that explains it doesn't really explain anything until you've shown that your God actually exists.
Well,
can you?
Well, to claim that something exists, you would need to have criteria established that either meet up with your claim or do not meet up with the claim. And as far as God would be concerned, God would be, number one, a reasonable entity.
Okay, so I'm making up a criteria. I'm making up a criteria for a thing that fits my claim, and it's that creature that spews these aluminum mugs. See what you're doing? That is not how it's done. You can't just say, because I have an idea that fits the available information, that therefore my idea is automatically right. That's not how science works. What?
The very fact that we have ideas demonstrates the highest form of what exists, and that would be our reason.
Dude,
the fact that we have ideas shows that we have thinking machines in our body.
Yeah, would you mind please sticking on one subject and not the moment we start pressing you on one of your claims, you jump to another one? You've already done that with the origin of the universe. Now you're doing it with this.
How have I been doing that? Well, I apologize.
We have shown you that just saying this God idea you have, that answers the open questions in science, which it doesn't, by the way, because if it did, then most physicists would agree with it, and they don't, right? But we've shown you that is not how it works. That's not how you prove a thing exists. Because I can make up any number of things that answer any number of open questions. What you need to do is show that the thing you're proposing actually exists. Can you or can't you?
God would subsist, so it would be a foundation for existence.
No. So
you would demonstrate
is that a no or a yes?
You would demonstrate that everything known would have a foundation.
So suppose everything does have a foundation. How have you demonstrated that foundation is your God?
Well, what would you consider demonstration? Would a logical argument be
my problem.
a form of demonstration?
I'm not the one proposing your God, dude. You are. This is basic burden of proof. You say you think this thing exists. Great. It is your job now to demonstrate that it exists. Can you or can't you?
Well, I would base my demonstration on a logical argument.
Okay, logic is a fine thing, and it works when you feed in facts. Okay? The problem is you're just doing your logic in your brain disconnected from reality. And you're thinking that, if I have open question A and I can imagine answer B, that therefore I've solved it and answer B must be the truth. That doesn't work because you haven't shown that answer B is really the answer unless you can show that B really exists.
Well, what if I said that Bigfoot created the universe?
You're in the same boat as you are now.
No, that's wrong, because Bigfoot would be a physical construct, whereas God would be metaphysical.
I'm imagining a cosmic Bigfoot. There.
A cosmic Bigfoot.
Sure.
Well,
it's the ground of all being, this Bigfoot.
And this Bigfoot, he would consist of factors that would exist in space and time, like a foot and a large foot.
No. You're being too literal. You're being too
How far
literal.
from it?
Bigfoot doesn't actually have feet. That's a common misconception. See, I can sit here all day making shit up. That is exactly what your religion is. It's a bunch of made-up stuff.
Here's the bigger problem with what you're trying to do, is you're looking at a mystery. There's a point at which we cannot look any further when we're investigating the Big Bang. And we have not been able to come up with models and answers that provide us with all the information, and we may never be able to. And so you're looking at that mystery and saying, I need to come up with some sort of explanation for this. Well, here's this God thing, which, by the way, it's a panacea. It's an explain-all. It has every characteristic you ever want it to have for whatever thing you're wanting to answer. And so you say, look, this meets all the criteria of this, therefore it's the most plausible answer. And that's just wrong. Because, number one, you're assuming that your understanding of the question and the mystery is correct and accurate. And it's clearly not. Because we don't have a good enough understanding to posit what may or may not have been causes. There's multiverse theories. There's a ton of different theories about the origins of the universe.
Well,
the second thing is, if you posit an answer that is a panacea, you have explained nothing. Your God has no explanatory power, because we explain things in terms of things that we understand. We explain things... The unknown with the known. You are trying to solve a mystery by appealing to a greater mystery. You have no evidence for it. You just went into it already believing this and said, how convenient. I have this belief, this claim about a being that would certainly answer every possible criteria for the Big Bang, so therefore it makes it plausible. Sorry, that's not the way it works.
Well, the evidence would be a logical argument. Like, the logical argument would be, I define God, and God would be...
Sure, you can define God into existence.
Yes, and I've defined into existence a creature that spews little aluminum mugs. Defining a thing into existence doesn't make it exist.
Well, it would outline the criteria. If the criteria fulfills the role...
No.
We're going around in circles.
No, because there's actually, and I wasn't supposed to tell you this, there's actually a collective of transcendent universe-building fairies that actually meet all the criteria better, because they're also not supernatural and they don't interact with us. So they are far less troublesome than your God hypothesis.
Well, how can you have more than one fairy? How can you have more than one fairy outside space and time?
How can you have anything outside? How can you have anything outside of space and time? If you can define,
that would be pure reason. Reason would be a non-entity.
Andrew,
reason is a thing that takes place in brains.
If you can define a God to exist outside of space and time, why is it not also equally viable to define something else outside of space and time?
Well, because the one thing that could exist outside of space and time would be...
You're done. If you're going to assert that the only thing that exists...
Because special pleading.
Because my thing has been believed by a lot of people for a long time, and you just made up those pixies. Wow.
Yeah.
All right.